One of the most innovative educators that has ever contributed to the education of young children is Maria Montessori. Montessori was born in 1870 in an Italy that is totally different than the world that we live in today. At that time, the idea that a young woman, even from a well-off home, would become a doctor was unheard of. She shocked her father by letting him know that she wanted to study technical information, maths and sciences. Then she shocked him even more, and several other people, by letting them know she wanted to become a medical doctor. At that time, the only respectable occupation for a woman was that of teacher, and oddly, that was the last thing that Montessori wanted to be when she first started her education. However, through an interesting sequence of events, her medical background took her into interaction with children that we would now say had developmental delays or special needs, and she found her true calling in not only developing materials that would help those children to learn well, but help any child to learn well. As we talk about her method, her materials, and the things that she has contributed to education, I'd like you to consider a particular standard by which we may judge an innovator. Many of Montessori's ideas, using manipulatives for a child to learn the idea of quantities and manipulating quantities in math, using materials that are suited to a child's hand, having tables and chairs that they can move around and choose their work as they would like to. All of these things that are just a normal part of an early childhood classroom today were things that Montessori innovated. Because her ideas are just commonplace, that's actually evidence she was a true innovator, because we just consider the things that she brought into being to be the normal way that we would treat a child. One of the most interesting things that I have heard lately about Montessori that's come about since the time that I was teaching, mostly back in the 1980s, is that there are many people who attribute their creativity, their sense of self-direction to their Montessori education.
When Barbara Walters asked Larry Page and Sergey Brin, founders of Google, if their parents being college professors contributed to their success, they suggested a more significant influence. Both credited going to different Montessori schools as the way they learned to be self-directed and self-starters. They praised Montessori education for encouraging them to think for themselves and giving them the freedom to pursue their own interests. Montessori, together with Jean Piaget, the developmental theorist, stand as innovators who caused educators to finally look at the unique needs of the young child. Though Piaget is widely considered one of the most influential thinkers of the last century, Montessori's contributions are still recognized and appreciated by a relatively small segment of American education.
I hope as we explore Montessori's ideas and materials, you will get some sense of how you can use these ideas to bring into the lives of the children that you touch a sense of wonder at learning, a sense of being successful learners, and having a chance to have an introduction to learning in their world that suits them beautifully.
When I work with experienced Montessori educators, I use both versions of the triad. I explain my use of the words learner and mentor, as I have explained in previous episodes, but I also use the more familiar terms child and guide.
For anyone who has visited a Montessori school or has some familiarity with the Montessori method, they probably have seen the beautiful materials that are a part of the environment that's created for the child. A useful way to think about not only the Montessori method of education or how to operate within a true Montessori school or environment, but a way to think about interacting with the child at all, is to look at three specific aspects of that child's education and how they relate together. I've represented those with a triangle and those three aspects arranged around one of the triangles from the Montessori geometric cabinet. When considering how children learn, it's useful to focus on three different aspects of their learning. First, of course, is the child himself or herself. When we look at the child and we do our best to understand how he or she learns, we have the best chance of creating an environment and being a guide to that learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine one at a time those key aspects of a child's education. The child, him or herself, the environment in which the learning takes place, and the guide. The guide in a Montessori environment is sometimes called a director or a directress. In another setting, it might be called the teacher. We use the word guide specifically because a lot of what the purpose is in Montessori education for the guide is to connect the child to the environment. It's not so much imposing learning on the child as helping him or her use the environment for the best learning possible. When we look at the child, there are three aspects of the child, particularly the child before the age of 6, that are very useful to understand as we prepare them to learn. The first is the absorbent mind. One of the things that most people realize to some extent is that there are periods when children are more sensitive to certain kinds of learning than others. One of these is the period for language development. Many people realize that if a child has not heard the sounds of a particular language before they're 5 or 6 years old, it will always be difficult for them to make those sounds. When we hear people from other countries attempting to learn English and attempting to make all the sounds of English, it's pretty evident which sounds in the English language are not present in the language they learned when they were young children. These sounds become a difficulty for them in learning the new language because the time when their mind was absorbent for sounds has already passed. Can they still learn the language? Of course they can. Is it likely that their pronunciation will ever be as good as a child who learned the language before the age of 5 or 6? Not so much. There are other absorbent periods that are useful to understand. One of these is order. Unless a child learns how to create and maintain order in his or her environment between the ages of 1 and 3, it's very unlikely that will be something that will be easy for them in the future. The sensitive period for development of the senses is from 2.5 to 6, the same period as the development of manners or social graces. The sensitive period for movement and refining movement is 2.5 to 4. The sensitive period for writing is from 3.5 to 4.5 years old. If the child isn't exposed to writing during that time, something will always be a little bit more difficult than if they became accustomed to the movements of the pencil in their hand during that age. And finally, a sensitive period for reading occurs between age 4.5 and 5.5. In addition to the absorbent mind and the sensitive periods that are part of the absorbent mind, it's useful to understand that the child genuinely loves to learn, particularly if movement is a part of learning. Moving and learning are things that the child finds inherently desirable and a reward in and of itself. And then finally, it's very important for the child under 6 to understand the need for repetition. If it is set up where within the child's environment they can repeat a task over and over again until they are satisfied with the learning and the movement and the joy that is associated with it, they will be most satisfied. Of course, with the Montessori method, having materials that the child can use is important. But what's even more important is understanding the way that the child learns. If you do understand that there are periods of time in which the child needs to have extensive exposure to developing the senses, to writing, to reading, it's very easy to create those experiences whether or not you have access to thousands of dollars of Montessori materials or even a formal prepared environment. You can prepare an environment in the home that supports these needs of the children as well. In regard to the absorbent mind, it's very important to realize that that is exactly the way that the child learns. They just absorb knowledge, if it is the right kind of knowledge presented in a way that's accessible to them, just by being exposed to it. Simply by hearing someone speak a foreign language on a regular basis, the child will tend to pick up that language if they are within the sensitive period for language. In the same way, simply being given pencils and paper during the sensitive period for writing, they're going to have a better chance of developing that ability. Of course, we can enhance that even further. When we provide the child with the materials that are specific to those sensitive periods, we make it easier for them to develop those different areas. The child's love of learning is also something that's important to understand. Even though the child does love to learn, learning does not necessarily mean the same thing to you that it does to a 4-year-old. For a 4-year-old, learning is usually doing over and over and over again, thus the need for repetition. When the child moves, he or she is learning. There's an old saying,
I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. This is true for the young child even more than for any other age group.
In regard to the sensitive periods, there have been some people who have been critical of the Montessori method, usually for what they perceive as rigidity or pushing the child into reading or writing. From my perspective, nothing could be further from the truth. As you noticed from what I had setting out with our triangle, the child is exposed to concepts that are sometimes considered higher concepts. Most children probably don't learn about a curvilinear triangle until they're much, much older than 3 or 4, unless they're in a Montessori environment. Even as an adult, the distinction between an ellipse and an oval may not be something that was readily available to you until I just mentioned those names. Children love language. They love shape. They love movement. When you combine them in a way that fits for them, they love learning. And that's what the Montessori method is about. When you see something such as the shapes that are in the geometric cabinet, you see handles that make it easy for little fingers to manipulate. You see an isolation of difficulty that we'll talk about later. This is not a blue or a red or a yellow. This is a circle. And it's easy to distinguish from the square or the curvilinear triangle or the triangle because of the way that the material is set up. So the materials are set up in a way that is in coordination with the child's learning. Movement is a part of the learning. The ability to repeat the activity over and over again is a part of the learning. And the material being appropriate to the child and the absorbent mind stages that they are in is also a part of the learning.
Let's return for a moment to the pioneer in developmental research, Piaget.
He is probably one of the most well-known researchers that have helped us to understand that children genuinely perceive the world differently than we do as adults. One of his tasks is really a useful way to understand how differently a 3 or 4-year-old sees the world than you do. If I were to present this experiment to a 3-year-old, I'll explain to you the conclusion that she would probably make. Here's water. Here is another container. Now, notice how much water is in this container. Is there more water, less water, or the same amount? Obviously, I didn't hide any water. It's the same amount. It would be very hard for you to convince a 3-year-old that that is the case. Taller is more. So, despite the fact that she watched you pour the water from this short, fat container into the tall, skinny container, she would be absolutely convinced that there is now more water present. When you see experiments like this, it helps you to understand that the child's world really is a different world than the world that you live in. One of the concepts that I find most key from Montessori is the idea of following the child. What a good teacher or parent or guide of the child does is do everything possible to step into that child's shoes, to see the world the way that the child does. You may have, in a class in college, had the assignment to find a toddler or even a baby and attempt for 10 minutes to do everything that that baby or that toddler did. If you attempted that experiment, you probably found that it was next to impossible. The degree of exploring and activity and changing attention from one item to another is really genuinely more than we as adults can even do in the bodies and the minds that we have now. But when we make our best effort to step into that child's rate of doing things, step into that child's eye level of where they see the world from, and to step into what way of presenting things is easiest for them to understand, we're doing them a great service. There's another discipline that I find very useful in understanding how to deal with the world, whether it be adults or children, and this is something called Neuro-Linguistic programming. John Grinder and Richard Bandler studied people who do things well, including Virginia Satir, who was another advocate for children and families and gives us a lot of insight into the way that their world works. One of the concepts that came out of Bandler and Grinder studying therapists who did their work well is the concept of rapport. The idea of rapport is that in order to understand a person, you must do your best to physically step into their shoes as much as you can. If you're used to talking at this speed, and it happens to be that the people around you talk at this rate, and you go to another part of the country where it's much more the norm for conversations to take place at closer to this speed, you're going to find that there's a conflict of rapport. With the child, their speed is usually closer to this within one activity. The sequence of activities and the places they put their attention rapidly changes. But for them to be able to grasp a new activity, you need to meet their pace. Step into their rate of working, and you'll find that it's much, much easier. If you take a child on a walk and you walk at their pace, you'll find they can walk a very long way and enjoy doing so. If you ask their short little legs to walk at your pace, it's a very different story.
In our first schools, the children used to enter when 3 years old. No one could teach them because they were not receptive, yet they offered us amazing revelations of the greatness of the human soul. Ours was a house for children rather than a real school. We had prepared a place for children where a diffused culture could be assimilated from the environment without any need for direct instruction. Maria Montessori in The Absorbent Mind. The children who came were from the humblest social levels, and their parents were illiterate. Yet these children learned to read and write before they were 5, and no one had given them any lessons. If visitors asked them, "Who taught you to write?" they often answered with astonishment, "Taught me? No one has taught me." It seemed miraculous that they should have learned without the feeling of having been taught. Our teaching must only answer the mental needs of the child, never dictate them. Just as a small child cannot be still because he is in need of coordinating his movements, so the older child who seems troublesome being curious over the what, why, and wherefore of everything he sees is building up his mind by this mental activity and must be given a wide field of culture on which to feed. He must have absolute freedom of choice, and then he requires nothing but repeated experiences which will become increasingly marked by interest and serious attention during his acquisition of some desired knowledge. Maria Montessori in To Educate the Human Potential. The last part of our program was filmed at the 2013 International Montessori Congress in Portland. The event was significant because it brought together all the large Montessori associations working together with Association Montessori International to unite the Montessori community.
Hi, I'm Ralph Singh with the Wisdom Thinkers Network. We all know that the world is filled with more and more knowledge, but as Brian Swim said in his keynote, we lack the wisdom in how to manage our lives, let alone the environment. And that is Wisdom Thinkers' raison d'etre. Our simple deduction was that the world has lost its stories, and with it, the wisdom of how to live. So I set as a challenge for myself, having been involved in spirituality and values and education and public life for most of my adult life, which keeps getting longer, to be able to take stories from both sacred and secular traditions and make them accessible in public, private schools and with education for parents and children. And so we took stories from around the world, from 6 different sacred traditions, 5 different cultures, recorded them with music and sound effects, for which we won a Parents' Choice Recommended Award. We've got them no longer than 4 minutes, so our teachers can drop it into a teachable moment. A child comes in off the playground, kids come off the bus, or they intuit something's going on in class. They can say, I have a story I think I'd like you to listen to. Or with our study guide, for those teachers who like it, we've built out essential questions, simple discussion areas, given the background and the context of each story, which culture it comes from, how they use it, what lessons they want to use for their children using these stories. And so we've tried to take stories which teachers can build into role plays, readers' theater. The kids, we didn't put pictures specifically, so kids are doing their own artwork, they're adding their own music, they're writing their own versions, they're putting their own endings, and we have a wonderful time, and would certainly invite you to correspond with us and let us know about how you would like to use our stories.
One of the things we like to do is make sure that we help you with some resources for fundraising. And one of my favorite companies is Equal Exchange, fair traded goods that you can use for your fundraising. And I'm going to let Sarah tell you all about it.
Awesome. So I'm here with Equal Exchange. We are a fair trade cooperative company. We were started back in '86 by 3 friends who worked at a cooperative together in New England. Since then, they've met up with a bunch of farmers in South and Central America, in Africa, and in Asia in order to directly buy goods from them and sell them to consumers here in the United States. Because we're fair trade, that means that farmers get good wages, we're able to help them out with microloans, with affordable credit, and we're able to provide really, really good products for our consumers here. One of the things that I'm talking about today is our fundraising program. With that, your school, club, or organization can sell our chocolate, our coffee, other handmade goods like these great little finger puppets made in Peru. You guys get to keep 40% of the profits, and the rest of the money goes directly back to the farmers and artisans who are responsible for all of the goods.